It all started so quietly, so insignificantly, that at first, I barely noticed. My name is Michael Delacroix. I'm 34, living just outside of Chicago in one of those old, rundown apartments you'd probably pass by without a second glance. The kind with creaky floorboards, drafty windows, and a layout that feels like it's closing in on you. I suppose it's fitting that the place itself is as isolated as I've become. But I'm getting ahead of myself. I've been a graphic designer for over 10 years now. It's not glamorous, but it pays the bills. Freelance mostly, so I spend my days, and sometimes nights, in front of a screen, crafting designs for clients who are picky at best and impossible at worst. You could say I've got the perfect job for someone who doesn't really want to be around other people much. I wasn't always like this. I used to enjoy going out, seeing friends. I used to be normal. But that was before the whispers. It was late one night. I'd been working on a particularly frustrating project, eyes burning from staring at the screen too long, when I first heard it. A faint sound, like someone whispering just out of earshot. I remember looking around, thinking maybe I left the TV on, or maybe it was the neighbors through the thin walls. But the apartment was silent. Almost too silent, if that makes any sense. At first, I dismissed it. I mean, it was barely there. You ever get that feeling where you think you hear something, but you're not sure if it's real or just your mind playing tricks on you? Yeah, it was like that. I was tired, stressed, probably just a figment of my imagination. Besides, I'm not the kind of guy who believes in ghosts or any of that paranormal nonsense. I'm a rational person, always have been. I don't jump at shadows or let my imagination run wild. At least, I didn't. But that whisper, it was so subtle, so easy to brush off at first. But it kept happening. Every night, around the same time. I'd be sitting at my desk, or lying in bed, and there it would be again, soft, almost like a breath against my ear. It seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere all at once, impossible to pinpoint. Still, I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was nothing. It had to be nothing. Yet, each time, it would creep into my mind and stay there, gnawing at the edges of my thoughts. The more I tried to ignore it, the more it seemed to grow. I started finding excuses for why I was hearing things. Maybe it was stress, or maybe the old building was making weird noises. Old places like this do that sometimes, right? Yeah, that had to be it. Just the building settling. That's what I told myself, anyway. But the weird part? It always seemed louder when I was near the mirror. The next night, the whispers became more distinct. It was no longer just that vague sound you could barely hear, that barely there murmur that left you wondering if your mind was playing tricks on you. No, this time, it was different. I was lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to drift off after another long day. My mind was racing, as it always did when I was overworked and underslept, but in the midst of the usual swirl of thoughts, I heard it again. That whisper. But this time, it wasn't just a whisper. It was a word. No, it was more like a name. My name. I swear I heard it. Michael. It was soft, almost gentle, like someone trying to get my attention without startling me. I froze, every muscle in my body going rigid. My heart started to race, pounding in my chest so loud I could feel it in my throat. I told myself it couldn't be real. It was just the silence playing tricks on me. But deep down, something shifted. Fear. The kind of fear that creeps up on you slowly, like cold fingers brushing against the back of your neck. I sat up, staring around the room, trying to convince myself it was nothing. But there it was again, quieter this time. Michael. The sound seemed to echo from the mirror in the corner of the room, that tall, old-fashioned thing that came with the apartment. It was one of those mirrors that looked like it had seen better days, with a heavy wooden frame and a faint, almost imperceptible crack running down the side. I hadn't thought much of it before, but now it felt like it was watching me. Like it was more than just a reflection of the room. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was some noise from outside, the wind blowing against the windows, or the creak of the floorboards. But deep down, I knew better. The words weren't just sounds. They were clear, and they were directed at me. The nights after that got worse. The whispers became more frequent, and soon it wasn't just my name. There were other words, fragmented sentences that seemed random at first. Words that floated through the room like they belonged to someone else entirely. But the more I listened, the more they seemed to mean something. They were things I didn't want to hear, things I'd buried deep inside myself. Memories I hadn't thought about in years. Shameful things. Embarrassing things. Failures I'd worked so hard to forget. It was as if the voice knew me, knew my thoughts, my insecurities. It knew where to dig, how to get under my skin. It spoke of regrets, of the mistakes I'd made, the people I'd hurt, and the opportunities I'd squandered. Things no one else could know. Things I barely let myself think about, much less say out loud. And every night, the voice grew stronger. Clearer. I tried to ignore it, tried to drown it out with music, with TV, with anything that could fill the silence. But it didn't work. The voice always found a way to reach me, slipping between the cracks of my distractions, seeping into my thoughts like a poison. One night, I couldn't take it anymore. I stood in front of the mirror, staring at my reflection, feeling like a fool for even considering the possibility that a voice could be coming from a piece of glass. "What do you want?" I whispered, my voice barely audible, my breath fogging up the surface. The silence that followed was deafening. I thought for a moment that maybe I'd imagined the whole thing, that I was just losing my mind from lack of sleep. But then, as clear as day, the voice answered me, a single word that chilled me to the bone: everything. And just like that, I knew I was no longer alone in my apartment. Something was there with me, something that wasn't content with just whispering from the shadows. It wanted more. It wanted me. As the nights dragged on, the voice became more than just a disembodied whisper. It was personal now, deliberate, invasive, like it was burrowing into my mind, tearing apart everything I thought I knew about myself. It wasn't just echoing my thoughts anymore. It was speaking to me, directly. It knew things I had never told anyone. My deepest, darkest secrets, the kind of thoughts that keep you up at night when you think about all the mistakes you've made, the people you've let down, the ways in which you've failed. The worst part? It didn't just speak those things, it mocked me with them. I could be sitting at my desk, working on a project, or just mindlessly scrolling through my phone, and then I'd hear it. "You think you're worth something, Michael?" The voice would say it in this low, almost pitying tone, like it was talking to a child who didn't understand how the world worked. "You're just wasting your time. You've wasted your life." And it was always right. That's what scared me the most. It didn't just pull random fears from the air. It hit me with the things I already believed about myself, the things I tried to keep buried. It knew exactly where to push, exactly what to say to make me feel like nothing. "You're weak. You always have been," it would whisper. "Everyone knows it, Michael. That's why they leave. That's why you're alone." It started to feel like the voice was following me everywhere. It didn't matter if I was in the bathroom, in the kitchen, or even outside of the apartment. It would find me, slipping into my thoughts, filling my head with its poison. I started to doubt myself in ways I never had before. Simple things, like whether I locked the door or turned off the stove, became huge sources of anxiety because the voice was always there, whispering doubt. "You'll forget," it would say. "You'll mess up, just like you always do." At first, I tried to fight back. I would argue with it, tell it to shut up, tell it that it didn't know anything. But that was just me lying to myself. It did know. It knew everything. Every fear, every insecurity, every shameful little thought I'd ever had. And it used them against me, over and over, until I couldn't tell where the voice stopped and my own thoughts began. The worst part came at night, when I was lying in bed, trying to sleep. That's when the voice would get the loudest, the cruelest. It would talk about my failures, my wasted potential, about how I'd never amount to anything, how everyone I loved had either left or was about to leave. And I couldn't shut it out. I'd lie there, staring up at the ceiling, my mind spiraling further and further into darkness. "You'll never escape me," it would say, a low hiss that made my skin crawl. "You're mine, Michael. You've always been mine." I tried everything to drown it out. I stopped sleeping with the lights off. I played music all night, hoping the sound would cover it up. But nothing worked. The voice was always there, waiting for the quiet moments when I couldn't distract myself. It knew when I was vulnerable, and that's when it would strike, reminding me that I had no control. That it was always watching, always waiting for me to break. And it was winning. I could feel it. Every day, I felt a little less like myself, a little more like I was slipping into something darker, something that wasn't me. I was scared to admit it at the time, but deep down, I knew this wasn't just in my head. Something was in that mirror, something that knew me better than I knew myself, and it wasn't going to stop until it had taken everything. One evening, everything changed. I had been avoiding the mirror for days, almost like I could feel it staring at me whenever I was in the same room. It wasn't just a reflection anymore, it had become something more. Something alive. I didn't want to look at it, didn't want to acknowledge it. I'd cover it with a blanket, I'd try to position myself so it wasn't in my line of sight, but no matter what I did, I could feel its presence lurking. I remember that night so vividly. I had been lying on my bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to push the voice out of my head. It had been quiet for most of the evening, and for a moment, I thought maybe, just maybe, it had stopped. But deep down, I knew better. It was just waiting. Watching. Eventually, I made the mistake of glancing at the mirror, and that's when I saw it. My reflection. But it wasn't moving. Not like it was supposed to, anyway. I blinked, but the image in the glass didn't blink back. It just stood there, staring at me with this blank expression, its eyes dark and empty. It wasn't me. It looked like me, but something about it was off, twisted, like the reflection itself had become a separate entity, detached from my movements. I sat up slowly, my heart racing, every nerve in my body on edge. My reflection just stood there. Watching. There was a moment, a brief flicker of time, where I thought maybe it was just a trick of the light, or maybe I was seeing things because I was tired. But then, the reflection smiled. It was small at first, barely noticeable, just a slight tug at the corners of its mouth. But it wasn't my smile. I wasn't smiling. That grin, though, it was wrong, twisted in a way that made my stomach turn. The reflection seemed to be mocking me, taunting me, like it knew something I didn't. I stood up, slowly walking towards the mirror, trying to keep my composure, but the closer I got, the more that smile grew, spreading across its face like it was enjoying this. Like it was savoring my fear. I stopped just a few feet from the glass, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. I raised my hand slowly, hesitantly, watching to see if the reflection would mimic the movement. It didn't. It just stood there, grinning at me like it had all the power in the world. My hand hovered in the air, inches from the glass, and for a split second, I thought about touching it, about pressing my palm against the cold surface just to see if something would happen. But I couldn't bring myself to do it. Something about the idea of making contact with that thing, whatever it was, filled me with a deep, primal terror. That's when the reflection moved. It raised its hand, slowly, deliberately, mirroring the movement I had just made, but a beat too late. It wasn't following me, it was mimicking me, like it was playing a game. The smile widened, stretching across its face in a way that seemed inhuman, unnatural, like its skin was pulled too tight. I took a step back, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what I was seeing, but there was no explanation. None that made sense, anyway. The reflection shouldn't have been able to do that. It shouldn't have been able to move on its own. But it was. And then, as if to prove its dominance, it did something that shattered whatever illusion of control I had left. It winked. It was the most casual, deliberate thing I'd ever seen. A wink, like it was sharing some private joke at my expense. I stumbled backward, nearly tripping over my own feet as I tried to get away from the mirror. My reflection remained where it was, still grinning, still watching me with those empty, mocking eyes. I didn't know what to do. My mind was screaming at me to run, to get out of there, but my body felt frozen, locked in place by the sheer wrongness of what I was witnessing. That thing in the mirror, it wasn't me. It was something else, something that had taken my face, my likeness, and twisted it into something unrecognizable. After that night, everything changed. I couldn't look at the mirror without feeling this creeping dread, like something was lurking just beneath the surface, waiting. Every time I caught a glimpse of my reflection, I felt like I was being watched, not just by myself, but by something else. Something that wasn't me. I started avoiding mirrors altogether, not just in my bedroom but everywhere. The bathroom, the kitchen, even the windows at night. I couldn't stand the thought of seeing that thing again, smiling at me, mocking me with that twisted grin. But avoiding mirrors wasn't enough. The presence, whatever it was, had started to seep into every corner of my life. I could feel it, even when I wasn't looking. It was like a shadow, always just out of sight, always just beyond my reach. I stopped sleeping. I stopped eating. The voice, oh God, the voice, became relentless. It wasn't just at night anymore. It followed me throughout the day, creeping into my thoughts, whispering in my ear like it was standing right next to me. Michael. It would say, that familiar, taunting tone making my skin crawl. You can't hide from me. I tried to ignore it, tried to tell myself that it was all in my head. But every time I closed my eyes, I saw that reflection, that smug smile, those eyes filled with something far darker than I could ever comprehend. It knew me. It knew every fear, every weakness, every doubt I'd ever had, and it used them against me, over and over again, until I couldn't tell where my own thoughts ended and the voice began. I became obsessed with covering up every reflective surface in my apartment. I draped blankets over the mirrors, taped up newspapers over the windows, anything to block out the chance of seeing that reflection again. But no matter how hard I tried, it wasn't enough. The voice wouldn't leave me alone. It whispered to me from the shadows, from the corners of the room, from the places where the light didn't reach. You can't escape, it would say, a low hiss that sent chills down my spine. You're mine, Michael. You've always been mine. I started seeing it in other places too, reflections where there shouldn't have been any. In the glass of a picture frame, in the reflection of a spoon, in the glossy surface of my phone screen. And every time, it was the same, that grin, those eyes, that overwhelming sense of dread that wrapped itself around me like a noose tightening around my neck. I stopped leaving the apartment. I couldn't face the outside world, couldn't risk seeing my reflection in a store window or a puddle on the street. The idea of that thing following me everywhere, watching me, waiting for the right moment to strike, it was too much. I barricaded myself inside, closed off from everything and everyone. I ignored phone calls, emails, everything. My work fell apart, my clients stopped calling, but I didn't care. None of it mattered anymore. The only thing that mattered was staying away from the mirrors. But the more I isolated myself, the stronger the presence seemed to grow. It was like it was feeding off my fear, growing more powerful with each passing day. I could feel it, inching closer, wrapping itself around my mind like a parasite. And no matter what I did, no matter how hard I tried to fight it, I could feel myself slipping further and further away. The worst part was the feeling of inevitability, like I knew, deep down, that there was nothing I could do to stop it. The reflection, the voice, the presence, it was all closing in on me, slowly, methodically, like a predator playing with its prey before the kill. And I was powerless to stop it. I didn't know how much longer I could hold out. The voice was everywhere now, inescapable, and the reflection, God, that reflection, was waiting. It was always waiting, just beyond the surface, just out of reach. And I knew, one day soon, it was going to come for me. I could feel it in my bones. The days blurred together after that, an endless cycle of waking up to the same creeping dread, the same feeling that I was being watched. Every time I moved through my apartment, I could feel its presence, like it was right there, just behind me, just out of sight. I barely ate, barely slept. I was a shell of myself, hollowed out by fear, by the constant barrage of whispers and that haunting grin. The worst part wasn't even the terror, it was the helplessness. I knew something was coming, something I couldn't stop, and it was only a matter of time. One night, I found myself standing in front of the mirror again. I don't even remember how I got there. One moment I was sitting on the edge of my bed, staring at the floor, and the next I was standing in front of that cursed thing, staring at my reflection. Except this time, it wasn't just me. The reflection was still, like before, unmoving, but this time it felt different. It wasn't just mirroring me, it was waiting. I couldn't look away. My heart was pounding in my chest, my breath coming in short, shallow bursts, but I couldn't move. My reflection stood there, staring back at me with those same hollow eyes, that same twisted grin that seemed to grow wider with every second that passed. It was like it was feeding off my fear, growing stronger, more real, with each moment I stood there. And then, it moved. At first, it was subtle. Just a twitch of the head, a slight shift in its posture. But it was enough to send a bolt of terror shooting through me. My reflection had moved, not in response to me, but on its own. I stood there, frozen, my mind screaming at me to run, to look away, but I couldn't. I was trapped, held in place by some invisible force, as if the mirror itself had latched onto me, pulling me closer to whatever waited on the other side. Then, the reflection raised its hand. Slowly, deliberately, it lifted its arm, its fingers stretching out toward the glass. It was mocking me, I could feel it. It was mimicking the movements I hadn't made yet, as if it knew what I was going to do before I even did it. And that grin, it kept growing wider, stretching across its face in a way that didn't seem possible. The skin around its mouth looked like it was about to tear open, like it was barely holding itself together. I wanted to scream, but the sound died in my throat. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. All I could do was watch as the reflection reached the surface of the mirror, its hand pressing against the glass. And then, without warning, it pushed through. The glass rippled like water, and before I could even process what was happening, its hand was on my side. Cold. It was so cold. I felt its fingers wrap around my wrist, tight, pulling me closer. My body moved against my will, drawn toward the mirror like a puppet on strings. The reflection wasn't just mirroring me anymore, it was dragging me into its world. I struggled, trying to pull away, but its grip was too strong. I could see it now, its face pressed against the surface of the glass, that grotesque grin plastered across its face as it yanked me closer and closer. And then, just as its other hand began to reach through the mirror, I felt something inside me snap. The voice, the whispers, they were screaming now, louder than they'd ever been. "You can't escape." It shrieked, over and over, a chorus of voices blending into one. "You're mine, Michael. You've always been mine." In that moment, I knew there was no way out. The reflection, whatever it was, wasn't just trying to scare me. It wanted me. It wanted to take my place, to pull me into that twisted world behind the glass, and I was powerless to stop it. I felt my feet leave the ground as it pulled me closer to the surface of the mirror, the cold glass pressing against my face. And then, just as I was about to be dragged through, everything went dark. When I woke up, I was lying on the floor in front of the mirror, my body drenched in sweat, my heart racing. I don't know how long I was out, minutes, hours, maybe even days. But when I looked up, the mirror was just a mirror again. My reflection stared back at me, perfectly normal, perfectly still. But I knew it wasn't over. It was waiting. After that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was on borrowed time. The thing in the mirror, it wasn't done with me. I tried to convince myself it was just a bad dream, a hallucination brought on by stress or lack of sleep. But deep down, I knew better. The reflection had crossed the line. It wasn't just playing games anymore. It was coming for me, and there was nothing I could do to stop it. The days started to blend together, each one more suffocating than the last. I couldn't leave the apartment. Every time I tried, I felt this overwhelming sense of dread, like the outside world had become dangerous, hostile. It was irrational, I knew that. But it didn't matter. I was trapped, not by locks or walls, but by something far worse, my own mind. I stopped answering my phone. Friends, family, clients, they all tried to reach out, wondering where I'd gone, why I had disappeared. But I couldn't face them. How could I explain what was happening? That a voice was haunting me, that my own reflection had come to life and tried to drag me into some otherworldly nightmare? They'd think I was insane. Hell, maybe I was insane. That's what I kept telling myself, anyway. It would have been easier if I could just believe that. But every time I caught even the faintest glimpse of my reflection, I knew the truth. The thing in the mirror, it wasn't me, and it never had been. It was something else, something ancient and hungry. And it was getting stronger. It started small, just like before. I'd be washing my hands in the bathroom, glancing up for a split second, and I'd see it, my reflection smiling when I wasn't. Or I'd be walking past a window and catch a flash of something that wasn't quite right, a shadow, a movement that didn't belong. It was always just out of sight, just beyond my reach, but it was there. Waiting. One night, I woke up to the sound of whispering. Not the soft, barely there murmurs that had started this nightmare, but something louder, more insistent. I sat up in bed, heart racing, and realized the sound wasn't coming from the mirror anymore. It was in the room with me. I could feel it, an oppressive presence, like the air had thickened, pressing down on my chest, making it hard to breathe. I turned on the light, my hands shaking, but there was nothing there. Just the shadows clinging to the corners of the room, darker and more menacing than they had any right to be. But the voice didn't stop. It was louder now, clearer. It was speaking my name, over and over, like a chant. Michael. 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 I couldn't take it anymore. I stumbled out of bed, barely able to think, and went straight to the mirror. It was uncovered, of course. I don't even remember taking the blanket off, but there it was, hanging limp on the floor like some kind of discarded barrier that had never really protected me in the first place. And there I was. Or at least, the thing that looked like me. It stood there, grinning, as usual. But this time, it wasn't waiting. It was moving. Slowly, deliberately, it raised its hand and pressed it against the glass, just like before. But this time, it didn't stop. The hand kept going, pushing through the surface of the mirror like it wasn't even there. The glass rippled and shimmered, and before I knew it, the reflection's entire arm was on my side. I wanted to run. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to get out, to flee, to save myself. But I couldn't move. The grin on its face stretched wider and wider, impossibly wide, until it looked like the skin of its face was about to split apart. It was me. But it wasn't me. It was everything dark and twisted about myself, everything I hated, everything I feared. And it was standing right in front of me. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. The reflection reached for me, its hand cold and wet like the surface of the glass, and for a moment, I thought it was going to pull me through, drag me into that other world where nothing made sense and everything was wrong. But it didn't. It just stood there, inches from me, its face inches from mine, staring into my eyes with those hollow, empty sockets that seemed to go on forever. And then it spoke. "Your turn," it whispered, its voice a low, guttural rasp that sent shivers down my spine. "Your turn." I don't know what happened next. Everything went black. When I woke up, the mirror was shattered, pieces of glass scattered across the floor. My reflection was gone, but I could still feel it. I could feel it watching me from the shards, from the fragments of glass that littered the ground. And I knew it wasn't over. It was never going to be over.